Hello, we are the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, or ACAMH for short.
I'm Uta Frith. I'm Emeritus Professor of Cognitive Development at University College London, and I have done research in autism since my PhD years, which were 1966 to 68. So I was born in Germany during World War II. I grew up in Germany, and my father was an artist. So I grew up in a slightly bohemian household where there was a lot of interest in the arts. And I begged my parents to send me to a school where I could get a really heavy-duty classical education. They let me choose. They always let me do what I wanted, which I really, really appreciate now. And it meant that I had a background from which, when I got to university, I could really choose almost anything. And I tried out many different subjects. I tended, towards the arts to begin with, and ancient languages. But very soon I was captured by other things, like other lectures that I went to. And I have to say, it may sound a bit silly, but I was captured into psychology through a lecture I attended, which was on analysis of variance. The subject you'd imagine would be least attractive, but I was absolutely fascinated that you could measure things on tests and you could do proper statistical comparisons, you could control for certain confounding variables, and I thought, wow, this is so interesting. I signed up, to do the course, and I was sort of sucked into it because there was a lot of seminars and coursework to be done. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a wonderful experience to be a student in the early 60s. That was all in Germany. And I also came across then cases that were part of the training that young doctors got, and this was psychiatry, so the psychologists could attend as well. And these were ward rounds, grand rounds, where patients were in fact presented by the professor, and the students were all watching and could even ask some questions. Also, I think nobody ever dared. And these, the patients were, of course, volunteers. They agreed to do this. And it was often incredibly lengthy, more than an hour. And they would talk about their lives, they would talk about their symptoms, and they would respond to questions. And it seemed to me such an extraordinary experience, that you could see that people who were sometimes perfectly rational in the way they answered questions could still at the same time say, but I have this urge to wash my hands and I must do it and I cannot escape it, and I've always been like that. So this sort of thing absolutely fascinated me, because I thought, what a strange thing the mind is, and maybe we can understand much more about it if we start from the pathology end, a little bit like medicine developed from studying disease, and then we learned more about health and normal typical physiology, which has all benefited us greatly. Psychology, in comparison, was still very much at the beginning of its expansion. Yeah, I did clinical training in London at the Institute of Psychiatry. There was, I think, only one possible training course in clinical psychology, and it was the place to be. That's what I'd learned in Germany. That's why I came over, to find out more about behavior therapy, behavior modification. That was a new thing. And it was just the beginning of the first really successful drug treatments of psychiatric diseases. But what I found when I did this training was that I was really, really attracted to go to the children's ward. There was a rotation, of course, you went to different wards, but I asked to be on children's twice, if at all possible, because somehow it seemed to me that there was a particularly interesting group of children, and these were the autistic children. So I did meet children who were inpatients and children who were brought by their parents just for a first assessment by incredibly puzzled parents, and also I think the staff were still very, very puzzled about what was wrong with these children. So I could watch how through nice and careful questioning lots of factors could be ruled out. Now the interesting thing was that the children I saw first, and I talk about just one child, one little boy, very, very typical, absolutely no language, but looked very beautiful, very attractive, which made everyone think, oh, we must be able to help this child to maybe communicate, even if not by words, in some other means. And there was certainly the idea that perhaps we could turn a switch, perhaps we could do something amazing. And a child like this little boy that I remember could be woken up, as it were. But at the same time, there were lots of strange ideas. I remember that the parents were almost, I think they were sort of trying to say, what did we do wrong? They were offering kinds of explanations like that the mother went to a hospital when the child was very young and was abandoned perhaps by the mother for a couple of weeks. Could that have been the cause? Some people took that sort of thing very seriously at the time. To me, it seemed absolutely, even from the very beginning, preposterous. You couldn't possibly say there could be some kind of neglect of that kind that could produce this particular condition, because I knew full well that there were lots of variations in how people bring up their children, which included neglect, and it would not produce autism. What fascinated me was the paradox of the beautiful, healthy, typical appearance and the very atypical behavior. Behavior that was just completely out of bounds of convention. It could not be predicted. And it also seemed to me that the children could not predict my behavior or anybody else's behavior. In fact, they seemed to ignore people. So it fascinated me that they could interact with the physical world, the real world. So they had toys that they could play with, they could do jigsaw puzzles, they would do very well on, and yet they could not respond and interact in the normal way, even in the most basic way, even just trying to get their attention, to call their name, they wouldn't respond. So to me that was an extraordinary puzzle that I really wanted to find out more about. A condition like autism was sort of like a prime example of how some kind of psychogenic cause, probably to do with mother-child relationship, could result in this kind of rejection of any social contact, and only by re-establishing this kind of attachment through years and years of psychotherapy, play therapy, that kind of thing, could you turn the child around and make it, receive it back into the normal family and society. Of course, it was complete nonsense. It never worked. It just did not work. And yet, I do remember one book which irritated me no end, because it was, it was quite a popular book, kind of bestseller. It was called Dibs in Search of Self, written by a therapist. And I think it must have been a completely made up story, but it was presented as a real case of a boy who was unresponsive by all means, who was clearly, in some sense, very intelligent because he could relate to the physical world, but absolutely not to the emotional, social world. And this therapist described how through therapy and just, letting the child be and play, this child could be turned around, made normal. Lots of accusations in this book about the coldness of the mother that was there in the background, and of course there's this infamous label of the refrigerator mother, and this was very much the one strong theory that that was just, the cold mothers. This was part even of the first descriptions of autism, this sort of suspicion that there was something a bit cold and chilling about the parents, especially the mother. They were intellectual and they were, more interested perhaps in their jobs than their children. All sorts of characteristics that, of course, you could find a lot in other spheres of life, and it's nothing to do with autism. So it seemed to me a very wrong track. Many people thought that. And we were, in fact, looking for a better description of what's actually going wrong before trying to do something about it. My supervisors, Beate Hermelin and Neil O'Connor, were true mentors to me, and in fact I was something like a apprentice. I went along with them when they did their experiments. I recorded, I helped, I learned on the job, as it were, because this was a very, very novel way of trying to do very rigorous experiments with these children who most people said are untestable. Of course they are testable if you do it the right way, if you give the tasks that they then actually appeal to them, that they can do. So this was the skill that I tried to learn, and I felt that this was a wonderful way to get an idea, get a slight glimpse of the mind inside, that you tried to be very receptive for ideas from general experimental psychology, which, by the way, at that time really underwent a revolution, a sort of information revolution. The idea that what actually happens in the mind is that information is being transmitted, and information coming in from the outside is being translated into representations in the mind, and that they will then control actions. These kinds of ideas that we take now for granted, and are much more refined than I'm just now saying, were totally novel, but they really, really appealed to me. And I thought we could look at, separately input processing, output processing, and what went on in between the input and the output. This was sort of the model, the black box being this unknown, the mind, what the mind would do in translating information that comes in and that goes out. And that something there was clearly wrong in autism. That's really what I felt was a basis from which you could start and which you could then investigate further. Now, the theory of mind idea and autism really was what people now call a game changer. Up to then, for many years, I think about 10-15 years, I'd done experiments that tried to tackle this information processing riddle, what's wrong where, what is going on. And I think we did make progress. We could, for example, show a lot of cognitive abilities that were present in children where people might not have expected them to be there because of the lack of communication. But in the end, they were unsatisfactory because they didn't explain why there wasn't communication. So this seemed to be sort of receding. Why was there this problem in social interaction? And what exactly was it? What kind of problem? And I think here the theory of mind idea came together at a time with other ideas that were part of what Lorna Wing researched, also at the Institute of Psychiatry, with her PhD student, Judith Gould. And they did a really big study, a whole population study, and they did many tests to find out what is different in children who are diagnosed with it. It was actually a narrow diagnosis of autism. That's all we had at the time, very different from what we're looking at now. These were all children who had intellectual disability. And most of them, if not all, had very poor, if any, language. So they were difficult. And the tests you could give them, were rather limited. But Lorna Wing, Judy Gould, included one absolutely revealing test, and that was a play test, a symbolic play test, which really mainly, giving some materials to children and let them play with it. But of course that's not all. You had to score them in a very interesting analytic way. And one of the scores was really about, could a child pretend that something like a little toy was, for example, a teacup that you could pour tea in, something like that. And they found that the children diagnosed as autistic were very much poorer with this score than other children who were equally intellectually disabled but not diagnosed autistic. Now, this was absolutely critical. I think at the time, the first reaction was people saying, oh, play, pretend play, what should we worry about that? If the autistic children do that, don't do that so much, so what? We want to look at their language, at their communication, much more important things. But it stuck in my mind as an absolute vital clue to something, which of course I couldn't really make sense of, but it really, really stuck out to me as something that really one should remember, as something about that kind of symbolic play that was special, that made, was very early present, but also true for the older children that were in that big population study. So I did come across this paper in 1978 by Primack and Woodruff, and it was called Does a Chimpanzee Have a Theory of Mind? So it's the first time that I heard about, theory of mind. It was like a funny term. It was a bit of a, nickname. Of course, theory of mind is something that philosophers talk about, so how can chimpanzees have it? But it was the first time that it really made sense to think you could test this experimentally, and that's what Primack and Woodruff did. They did some kind of deception game with chimpanzees, and they tried to find out whether the chimpanzees actually realized which was the deceptive experimenter who didn't really give them the reward that they actually deserved, or if they didn't. The results were a little bit equivocal, this is still, even today, it's debated, do chimpanzees have theory of mind? Maybe yes, maybe sometimes, maybe not, depending on how you really define it. But the critical thing about this was that, there was a handle of how to approach this experimentally. And in Salzburg, Josef Perner and Heinz Wimmer got together and devised a wonderful experiment, which they called the Maxi experiment, and we now know it as the Sally-Ann task, because we have various variations of it, which was actually inspired by what Primack and Woodruff did. Although there were other historical traces that were acknowledged by Perner and Wimmer as to what this idea of theory of mind is, but they really operationalized it. So they would say, well, I will say a child has definite evidence of this theory of mind if they can understand what it means to have a false belief. Everyone knows the Sally-Ann task. It was designed together with Simon Baron-Cohen, who was my PhD student at the time, who carried out the experiment, and with Alan Leslie, who was a theoretician of development and who brought a particular insight into this triangle. And that was his idea that pretend play is a critical very first appearance of theory of mind. So you can see the link to the lack of symbolic pretend play as in Wing and Gould's study, and the idea that perhaps that is leading, in the case of autism, to certain communication difficulties and maybe not understanding that people have beliefs or false beliefs, true beliefs, or even desires or other mental states. So attributing mental states, how can we test this? Simon Baron-Cohen did the experiment, which is now known as the Sally-Ann experiment. It's too well known, but here are the dolls I think this one is Sally, and this one is naughty Anne. And of course, Sally has her basket and puts a marble in there. Naughty Anne takes it out and puts the marble into her own box. Child watches all this. Sally goes out. Sally doesn't watch this. And when Sally comes back, the question is, where will Sally look for her marble? And of course, Sally must look in the basket where she put the marble, because she wasn't there. So she doesn't know that the marble is no longer in her basket. She has a false belief. She believes the marble's in the basket. So children aged 5 or so immediately know this, immediately get this, but younger children actually don't, and that's very, very interesting. Why they don't, and what is different, and what it actually means. But this was only one of several experiments with autistic children. There's this other one, the Smarties experiment, where again the question is, what do you think is in this? Of course you say Smarties, and then, surprise, oh, it's a horrible pencil. That's really, really disappointing. Anyway, that's what's in the box. The question is, if I call the next child in, what will that child say is in the box if I ask this question? What will Billy say? Now, autistic children tended to say pencil, because that's what's really in the box, and they knew it, and that's reality. But they didn't take into account that Billy, who's never been in this room before and has never seen this, must believe that it's Smarties that are in the box. So the correct answer, of course, is Smarties and not pencil, even so it's the reality. So this is this interesting idea that perhaps autistic children can orient to the physical world very well and are dominated by that. But the mental world of beliefs and desires and so on is a bit of a closed book to them. They do not attribute these states. And so much of the work with Alan Leslie in particular was trying to trace consequences of this. What would it explain about autism if that was the case, which we believed it was, that they had this essential problem in attributing mental states to others. And we thought that it really does explain a lot about their particular difficulties in social relationships, which are actually much more subtle than people often assume. So these children are not totally oblivious, totally asocial. This is one of the things that I also learned quite slowly, but it's sort of that they cannot quite anticipate in a communication what it is that you know and what they need to tell you, and what it is that you want them to know, and what's really important, what's really relevant in a particular situation. So it seemed, for example, it explained to us children who would always say the same thing in a way that people would say, well, that's just boring. No, but it's much worse than boring. Is actually they don't seem to take into account that you've heard it before, you know it, it's not something they should tell you. They should tell you only the thing that you don't know. It would explain why we had all these reports about autistic children who maybe had pain, some accidents, some falling, and they would not tell about it. They would not tell their parents or their teachers what actually happened. That was a big puzzle, why they wouldn't do that. But again, it seemed as if they assumed, that was our interpretation, not consciously of course, that they assumed that what they knew, everybody else knew. Now, if you are in that situation, communication is like unnecessary. Communication has to do with transmitting things that you don't know. What would be more important? Immediately try and help, do something that might improve learning, education of autistic children, or try and identify what's actually the problem. And I think it seemed to me that just like, do as a single person, maybe I could do something with individual children, but that clearly was not going to be very far-reaching. I have no idea whether that could generalize, whether that would be just something that anybody else could do who had some skill in teaching far better than me. So it seemed to me that I really had to choose to do this basic research, and thinking what I'd really like to be interested in is understand what's wrong, and thereby also understand what indeed the typical processes are in the human mind that makes us such incredibly social human beings, and what tiny little wheel in this wondrous machine of the mind is stuck, that suddenly cuts out some of that mental world. So that's what I was really interested in, and I have to say that we're still very much at the beginning. We don't know all that much about the autistic mind. We don't know very much about the non-autistic, the ordinary mind. I'm a great upholder of curiosity-driven research and research going for novel ideas, because it's very, very easy to get stuck. If you find a very good idea, it's right to exploit it and carry out as many studies as you can. But if you find it doesn't really explain that much, it's really important to change and to try and investigate something new. So I think we do need this basic curiosity-driven research, which has no aim of immediate application, but it will always, in the end, inform applications and may even lead to applications, but you can't do this on command, as it were. It's the answer to everything. So I am the person who is really interested in diversity in life, and particularly in science and in research. So we have experienced that there's been a reconceptualization of what it means to do good science. It's not the individual genius anymore, although that's what historical anecdotes tell us. We know we need teams, we need many, many people working together, and I'm convinced that we need very diverse and very different people with different backgrounds, with different skills, all working together. So this is true for even the most basic research, but it's particularly true when we have a problem like autism. You've got to listen, for example, to the teachers who have a particular view, and they know something about what might upset a child or what might really facilitate some learning. We need to listen to the parents who, of course, have 24-hour experience all the time of what actually happens. So, for example, it's only from parents that we knew about the sleep problems of autistic children. It's now a hot topic, but my God, it's been going on since the very beginning. And I've always been aware that was a very, very serious, very practical problem that needs to have some attention. That's just an example. So you get the sleep researchers in, you have to get, EEG specialists who see what actually happens during sleep, is what's different. And you need the pharmacologists who will say, well, we have got some potential, medication here, let's try it out. So this is just an example of how everybody has got to get together. I think in the last 10 years or so, possibly a little bit longer, but there's been this huge awareness everywhere, worldwide I should say, about the varieties of autism. I actually hesitate to use the word spectrum. I think autism spectrum is very misleading. It immediately sets you to think that it's a continuum, it's sort of degrees. You can have a little bit of autism and more worse and worse and more difficult. Actually, I think it's variants. It's a family of different variants. There's some kind of family resemblance there, but there are many different kinds. They were not in the diagnostic manuals until quite recently. So now the goalposts have changed. So the criteria are so wide that we find it's a very frequent, not at all rare condition. You know, you get this sort of usual number of about 1%, possibly more, of individuals affected in a population. So it's very likely you come across one, you know one, you have somebody in the family. So it's a completely different idea of what autism is than I started out with. But this change has now led to another change, and that is that all of these are, of course, valid forms of being. We have these individual differences, and we value each individual, even if they are so different as to not fit into our niche. And I think this is the big problem about neurodiversity. The idea is, I think, to adapt the environment in such a way that the person with, for example, no theory of mind ability, or very weak theory of mind ability, to be perfectly comfortable, so that everything will be provided. Really like, you know, giving me a pair of glasses, because otherwise I just couldn't really see, so everything is absolutely fine. There is some idea that perhaps with ingenuity, with skill, with other people, you know, giving the right support, we can accommodate these diverse minds and different things. But this is going to be very difficult, because what you get shown to you when you watch television programs, when you read books, when you watch films, are the exceptional cases, these savants, these special skill people in autism who offer so much. I mean, society is so hungry for these geniuses, and I think they are very sometimes not portrayed very truthfully at all. You know, it's our sense of wonder at you know, the possibilities that the mind of somebody who can remember a whole encyclopedia of facts, or the wonder at the artist who can draw from memory sort of a whole scene of a cityscape or building in minute detail. It's just really something we wish we could explain. We think this is sort of a genius skill. This is wonderful. We need these people. Without them, you know, where would we be? Perhaps we wouldn't have science as we know it, inventions and creativity and so on. I think that's all part still of a bit of a mixed up fairy tale, not quite right. So we know that there are exceptionally talented people who are also autistic, but they're very rare. It's not really such a common feature of autism as people like to think. I think that's very important, because many parents who have autistic children say, you know, so I'm now expected to have this little genius here, but he's not like that. Actually, what you commonly find in at least about a third of the cases, that they have some special skill, but it's not like above average. It's just much better skill than other skills that they have, which might be much less than average. So it's that kind of up and down, strengths and weaknesses. It's part of that skill. So that's part of autism. That's something that we still have to unravel, how the mind can be so compartmentalized that some things work very well, other things not so well. Now, I think we haven't done too well explaining that yet. And and I think that the idea of what is intelligence, that's what we have to really puzzle out in the next 50 years. What do we mean by this? And why are people so diverse and so different? Again, we need diversity, as I've already said, we need that. But what is it that we value? Well, I think some of the things that we can say about intelligence already is that it is an ability to succeed in many different environments. Now, as far as autism is concerned, I think the success is very limited to certain environments only. So that is a difference. That's not just, let's forget about that and think that's not a minor problem. That's quite a major problem. And if we, the idea that we need to not only adapt to many different environments, different niches, as the evolutionary psychologists might call it, but we also have to look for new ones. We also have to prove ourselves in totally unproven and never experienced kinds of situations. For example, the climate change question. It seems to be taken for granted that there will be enormous changes, that there will be huge migrations of people whose land will be flooded, for example, or experiences huge droughts. So how do we adapt to this? What kind of niche will be found? And I think that's where human intelligence is the key player. Find totally new solutions and understand new problems. Maybe there are going to be such environmental catastrophes that will all be wiped out. That's what some people's kind of prediction is for the future. Autistic people have been strong influences on me. Individuals who I've had, dealings with, and I would talk to, and who would talk to me. I think they have given me completely new views, completely new insights. However, I have learned enormously from all the sort of teachers and parents and the researchers around me, from their different perspectives. So I don't want to mention individuals just because it's actually the mixture of individuals that I really think have been the most important thing for me to develop my own thoughts. Well, it's mental health in children and adolescents is the major problem, health problem of our days. It's only becoming clear very gradually. I think some of us who are part of ACAMH have always known this and have always lobbied that more needs to be done, more needs to be found out. So I think the benefits of ACAMH is that it exists at all as a powerful group to collect together the wisdom of the clinicians, the teachers, the speech therapists, and of course the researchers and the clinician scientists.
To be part of the advancement of child and adolescent mental health, visit www.acamh.org.